Harold was not a particularly interesting man. That was the first thing his neighbors might have said about him if anyone had ever asked, though nobody ever did. He was the sort of man who stood in line at the grocery store and somehow managed to be invisible, even if he was wearing socks with sandals. On this particular Tuesday evening, Harold decided that he wanted to go to bed early. His body, however, disagreed. His body, a stubborn piece of biological machinery, was wide awake. His mind, meanwhile, was buzzing with utterly useless questions such as, why does the ceiling fan wobble more on setting 3 than on setting 2? And if gravity is so strong, why don't socks stay paired in the washing machine? It was at this exact point that Harold decided the only cure for his sleeplessness was to bore himself into unconsciousness. And what could be more boring than physics? After all, physics was the study of motion, forces, and energy. And Harold, who once fell asleep during a documentary about paint drying, figured he stood a fair chance against physics. A story begins with motion, so Harold lay in bed and thought about motion. Everything move, he told himself out loud, which was strange because nobody else was in the room. Even when you're lying perfectly still, you're not actually still. The Earth is rotating at about 1,670 kilometers per hour at the equator. That means if I lie here for 1 hour, I've traveled further than I would if I'd run a marathon. Though, he added, I'd probably burn fewer calories, which is disappointing. This thought was not boring enough yet, so Harold decided to make it worse. He remembered Newton's first law of motion. An object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an external force. Well, Harold muttered, that explains why my neighbor's shopping cart rolled across the parking lot last week and dented my car door. There was no external force stopping it, except my car door, which I suppose means my car is technically an external force. Wonderful. I should put that on my insurance claim. Harold felt the warm weight of boredom beginning to blanket him, but his mind was not quite ready to surrender to sleep. Newton joins the bedroom. As Harold closed his eyes, he imagined Sir Isaac Newton sitting in the corner of his bedroom, powdered wig and all, frowning at him. You know, Harold, Newton said in a stern, British sort of way, the apple falling on my head was never really proven. It was more of a metaphor. People keep repeating it because they like stories about fruit. But the truth is, I did think very hard about why things fall, why the moon doesn't, why the tides do, why you continue to drop your toast butter side down. Harold nodded politely. Sir, with all due respect, your laws of motion are putting me to sleep faster than warm milk. Excellent, Newton replied. That was rather the point of them. Then Newton vanished, because hallucinated historical figures do not typically linger long in bedrooms. Friction, the unsung hero. Harold rolled over in bed and thought about friction. If motion was about things moving, friction was about things stubbornly refusing to move. Friction, Harold whispered, is why my socks never slide smoothly on the kitchen tiles the way they do in commercials. In reality, I try to glide across the floor, and instead I look like someone learning how to ice skate for the first time, except without the ice, or the skates, or the dignity. He thought about how there were two main types of friction, static and kinetic. Static friction is what keeps your book from sliding off the slanted desk, and kinetic friction is what happens once it actually starts sliding. This, Harold decided, was an excellent bedtime topic. If someone were to knock on his door at this moment and ask, Harold, what keeps you awake at night? He could answer honestly, static friction. Nothing clears a conversation faster than bringing up static friction. Gravity makes an appearance. But the heavyweight champion of boring physics, Harold knew, was gravity. Gravity is, in theory, very interesting. It keeps planets in orbit. It makes apples fall. It explains why coffee always spills when you're wearing a white shirt. But Harold managed to make it dull. He pictured the Earth pulling on him with a force equal to his mass times the acceleration due to gravity. He weighed about 80 kilograms, which meant the Earth was pulling on him with about 784 newtons of force. That's comforting, I suppose, Harold said. The entire Earth has nothing better to do than to keep me pinned to my mattress. You'd think it would have hobbies for fun. Harold imagined himself on the moon, where gravity is only 1/6 as strong. That means I'd only weigh about 13 kilograms there. Finally, I could join the lightweight division of boxing. Though the lack of oxygen would make sparring difficult, energy refuses to be ignored, just as Harold began to D. Harold had been asleep for all of 7 minutes when his bladder decided it had other plans. With a sigh, he rolled out of bed and shuffled toward the bathroom, muttering something about Newton needing to invent a law that prevented midnight bathroom trips. When he returned, still half dreaming, he lay back down and stared at the ceiling. The fan above him was spinning lazily on setting 2, wobbling just enough to make him nervous. That wobble, Harold thought, is a lesson in rotational dynamics. Or maybe just a reminder that I bought the cheapest fan at the store. Rotational motion and Harold's ceiling fan. Rotational motion, Harold recalled, was like linear motion, but with circles. Instead of distance, you had angular displacement. Instead of velocity, you had angular velocity. Instead of worrying about whether your car would stop in time, you worried about whether your ceiling fan would fly off and decapitate you in your sleep. He imagined explaining this to someone at a dinner party. Greater than, did you know your ceiling fan is a practical demonstration of angular momentum? And the other guest would nod politely before excusing themselves to check on the casserole, which was code for please never speak to me again. Harold remembered angular momentum was conserved. That meant if he somehow climbed onto the fan and tucked his arms in, the fan would spin faster. He immediately decided he would never test this theory. Conservation of angular momentum, Harold whispered. Proof that physics is willing to keep secrets forever, so long as you're spinning. The tale of inertia. Harold turned onto his side and tried counting sheep. But instead of sheep, he pictured spheres. Perfect, rolling, frictionless spheres. They rolled forever on a perfectly smooth plane. This was inertia in action. A body in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an external force. Which explains, Harold thought, why socks migrate under the bed. They start with just a little push when I kick them off, and then inertia takes care of the rest. Eventually, I discover them 6 months later, covered in dust and existential regret. If socks had personalities, Harold decided, they'd be philosophers, always drifting away, always questioning why they existed in pairs when entropy preferred them single. Harold versus buoyancy. Just when Harold's eyelids began to droop again, his mind suddenly wandered to water, specifically to the time he sank embarrassingly fast at a hotel pool, while children floated effortlessly on inflatable flamingos. Archimedes' principle, Harold muttered, an upward buoyant force equal to the weight of the fluid displaced. He remembered trying to float on his back, only for his legs to sink like anchors. Apparently, I don't displace enough water to impress Archimedes. The man would have taken one look at me and shouted, Eureka, before recommending I stick to shallow ends. Buoyancy, Harold decided, was overrated. People always described floating as peaceful, but Harold found it unnerving. The water cradled you, yes, but it also threatened to roll you over at any moment, like a passive-aggressive waiter serving soup. Time, the rudest dimension. Harold glanced at his alarm clock. 2:17 a.m. Time, he realized, was moving far too slowly. He began thinking about how time was technically the fourth dimension. Einstein said time was relative, which in Harold's experience was true. At work, 5 minutes stretched into eternity, while on lunch break, 30 minutes vanished faster than cake at an office party. Space-time, Harold mumbled. A fabric that bends under mass. Like my mattress, really. Except instead of stars and planets, it's just me and this pillow. I suppose I'm technically a celestial object in my own micro-universe. My bed is the cosmos. My cat, if I had one, would be the asteroid belt. The more he thought about it, the more he imagined himself as a star. A dim one, perhaps, but a star nonetheless, sagging the fabric of space-time in the middle of his bed. Truly, Harold whispered, I am astronomical. The dread of pressure. The thought reminded Harold of air pressure. He inhaled and exhaled, realizing the atmosphere was pressing down on him with a force of about 10 tons per square meter. That's comforting, Harold sighed. Invisible crushing weight. Lovely. He imagined explaining this to his aunt at Christmas dinner. Did you know the air is squeezing us constantly? Harold, she'd reply, Please stop talking about crushing forces while we're eating ham. Air pressure, Harold decided, was like taxes. You couldn't see it, you couldn't avoid it, and it was always there, quietly ruining your appetite. Electricity, the everyday trickster. Harold then remembered the time he shocked himself plugging in a phone charger. Electricity was always sneaky like that. Current, voltage, resistance, Harold muttered as if reciting a lullaby. Ohm's law, V equals I times R. He pictured